So we are live now, and thank you all for joining us from all the way from Egypt. Both Rafay, Adam, and Zoha are here. Rafay is, of course, an advocate, a lawyer, and he's also working on environmental, um, uh, I guess,
Environmental thing.
activism.
Yeah.
Environmental things, environmental activism. He can let's go. And Zoha,
when you start getting white hair, being called an activist isn't necessarily a nice thing.
and Zoha is covering COP27 as a journalist from what I've known. And Dawar, if you want to take it on.
So, what we're going to be talking about is there are certain things that, as a Pakistani and as a climate activist, all of us are concerned with. And particularly the angles of loss and damage have been the sort of stars of the show right now. And Pakistan is the poster child for loss and damage. And along with Pakistan, there are several other countries, such as you have massive flooding in Nigeria, you have severe droughts in Sudan. And all of these examples point to certain planetary changes which have only come about as a result of emissions and global warming of the global north. So that is where we want to sort of take a starting point in our discussion. That the chair of the presidency of the COP summit starts with the president himself saying that we want loss and damage on the agenda. And then we also don't want to be the COP where nothing happens, where everyone comes, talks about it, and then nothing happens. But at the same time, that's exactly what we're seeing. That loss and damage is on the agenda, but nothing else is happening. And then you have John Kerry come in and say that, listen, we realize loss and damage is something that we need to recognize, but we're not going to do it because we don't want liability on ourselves. So, starting with Rafay, you've been talking to a couple of policymakers, you have moderated a couple of discussions. What do you think that voices of the global south are loud enough, as loud as they can be, in your boardrooms or in formal terms and in polite settings? The only next step could be getting beyond the louder voices. So, what do you think that is there hope from this COP right now? Is there something that can be salvaged? Is there a push strong enough for the global north to act on? So, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ahmad, for having me on. Now, remember, this is the 27th COP. Uh, they're set up in a way that is sort of suboptimal. You have to have a consensus. These aren't places where you can run a majority decision. But it's very interesting because every country has a vote and a veto. So, Trinidad and Tobago has the same voting power as the United States and equally a veto power as well. And so it's a delicate sort of negotiation. But the primary purpose of the UNFCCC and all of these COP meetings is to get the global north to mitigate greenhouse gases and to have the global south adapt to them. And there are many sort of promises attached to this. You have the principle of common and differentiated responsibility. You have a global climate fund that's supposed to be capitalized by global north countries so that developing countries have funds to carry out adaptation. It's all based on a promise of sorts. And what we're seeing is, because not enough has been done in enough time, temperatures are rising, greenhouse gas emissions are not being stabilized. And so it's a kind of broken promise, which means that the adaptation funds that are available, first of all, another broken promise is the Global Climate Fund has not been capitalized to its potential or to its promises. And in many ways, if mitigation had taken place and if Global Climate Fund was properly capitalized and money was being sent to or being accessed by developing countries to prepare themselves for this, we wouldn't be seeing the types of catastrophic climate incidents that you're talking about, Dawar, all over the world, right? Countries would be better prepared. They'd have access to finances, especially countries in the global south. So in many ways, this claim for loss and damage, and mind you, there's no fixed definition of this right now, as far as I can tell. The claim for loss and damage is that there has to be a loss and damage facility is a financial facility that will be capitalized so that countries devastated by the climate crisis can have quick access to funds for rescue, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. It's almost like a third pillar of the UNFCCC is being evolved. You have mitigation and adaptation. Now you seem to have mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage because not enough was done for the first two, right? Now, the loss and damage in its very formulations in the Paris Agreement, first of all, excludes any liability from any country. So, liability ki baat ho nahi rahi, right? And as the minister Sherry Rahman said at a panel the other day, it may sound attractive to use the words reparations, but in a sort of delicate negotiation system like we have at the UN, where it's one vote, one veto, you don't want to be too aggressive, as it were. So, as a result, we sort of use the phrase loss and damage. What we have with the COP taking loss and damage on the agenda is the potential for some agreement at this COP that there will be a facility. There are plenty of details right now with loss and damage that need to be sorted out. For instance, the countries, questions relating to which countries are going to pay and how much and in what proportion. And on the other side, countries that are supposed to receive better have some sort of transparent frameworks in place so that everyone knows that the money that they're receiving is going to the people and to the projects that are resilient and so on and so forth. So there are plenty of questions that remain unanswered. But there is some optimism based on nothing but hope that I've come across that there might be an agreement that there will be a facility by the end of this COP. Let's see what Zoha has to say. She's been reporting. I've been stuck at the pavilion. She's been watching.
I was just going to take it to Zoha, that Zoha now has to tell us that does she have any hope? And further, since Raf has also already sort of pointed out how Sherry Rahman has been speaking about these things, about loss and damage, about a facility, about the need for climate aid to Pakistan. So do you think the Pakistani delegation is performing as per the needs of the situation? Because this is a situation that we've never seen. Pakistan has went to COPs before. There has been very little participation from our side, but this time we are the chair of the G77. We have a big and active delegation at COP as well, and which is also the attention of other delegations. So what do you think, how is the performance of the delegation, the ministry, and in overall sense, what are your hopes from the COP?
So I'll start with your first question, or the first part of your question, which is about hope. And I have to say that regardless of how bad things may look like now, the only way that we're going to get anywhere at all in whatever capacity is if we believe at the core of our being that we're going to be able to solve this crisis. And I know that sometimes it sounds like doe-eyed optimism, but we have absolutely no other way to be or no other way to behave. So I do have some faith. I obviously also have skepticism, and call it occupational hazard, call it just, observation from what I've seen around. So so that would be my answer to your question. I do have hope. Hope is what got us here this far, right? That's what got us loss and damage on the agenda. Sure, it's taken time, but the movement is taking momentum. We've got more voices joining in, more prominent voices joining in. I also think another reason why I have hope is that because countries have a lot of ego. The countries hosting the COP. So Sharm does not, or Egypt does not want to be the COP that ends up with nothing, right? And so there's that as well. There's that element to it as well. They want to be able to be the COP that took the conversation forward. So I guess I do believe in that kind of optimism. I also believe in politicians and policymakers' egos, for that matter. I feel like they could go either way. As far as the Pakistan delegation's performance is considered, I think that we have to applaud it for really pushing loss and damage and that conversation out onto the international platform. Small island nations had been doing it for a while, and I think we have to laud them more than anything else. I don't think anyone's pushed that conversation as far as they have. And it's that momentum that they've built over the years since Rio. But because the world really saw what climate change can do to communities and to countries in the face of, or in the example of the Pakistan floods, and then also the stars were sort of aligned because we are chair of G77 this time around. So I do think that our performance is good, and our minister is doing a great job of putting that, that hope, and that demand also, to an extent, that we require developed countries to take on this role of taking responsibility. Show reparations may be, kind of like an icky word to use in negotiations, but I'm a journalist, so I can use it. They absolutely have responsibility for that and towards that. And that's where protests and outside voices at COP come in. That's where civil society comes in. And that is why this is like, as much as, there's younger people losing faith in this institution, there's also hope, because you've got your delegations on one side that do this in the diplomatic way, and then you've got your civil society on the other hand that pushes for it in a more aggressive way. So to answer the second part of your question, I do think Pakistan is doing what is required of it right now, which is to keep pushing that we're not capable of handling this on our own. And the we does not just mean Pakistan. It means the Maldives. It means Sri Lanka. It means, Nigeria. It means Ethiopia. It means so many different countries that do not have the infrastructure to deal with climate change. So I think that's where I'd end it. But yes to hope, yes to Pakistan's performance this time around.
Ahmed, I think we lost you there for a bit.
I wanted to still on or not.
It's never lost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask. So, like, considering there's hope and everything, like, absolutely. But how is it? How is this COP any different from the previous ones? Especially considering it almost feels like Pakistan fell into the leadership role, or was handed the leadership role. And like it wasn't, like it didn't really strive to become a leader at COP27, because the previous COP, there were reports of the federal minister and like on climate and the advisor contesting with each other, whereas they should have been presenting the Pakistani case as well. So how is it any better, and what is Pakistan's commitment to the climate? Like, I mean, does Pakistan's commitment to the climate conversation this time around seem a bit more rigorous? Rafay, perhaps you could take on it, because, like, I mean, you've been moderating, and then if Zoha could also talk about it.
It is my first COP, so I can't really compare it to others, but I am familiar with the position the Pakistani delegation has taken in the past. And the previous delegations would showcase Pakistan's many successes in conservation for, like, dolphins, snow leopards, afforestation, these sorts of things. And that was how Pakistan would leverage the argument. And I believe that it's on the basis of this stance that the ministry has been focusing on, I think, 6 or 7 streams within the UNFCCC and COP process, streams such as adaptation and climate finance. But if you recall, when these floods took place, within days, both the Prime Minister of Pakistan and the Chief of Army Staff were giving statements along the lines that Pakistan's a net small greenhouse gas emitter, and yet other countries are responsible for this. So in many ways, we've seen a change in the discourse in Pakistan about climate change. We've been handed this remarkable tragedy of sorts, this huge climate incident. And it's changed some level of appreciation of the subject. Because, look, the World Bank has said that reconstruction costs in Pakistan are somewhere in the region of $30 billion. And there was a country development report that the World Bank launched, I think, 2 days ago, where they project that for the next decade, or for the next until 2030, Pakistan's going to need something in the region of $340 billion to be able to essentially make sure it's standing on its feet and resilient enough for the future climate strikes or climate impacts it's going to receive. And in many ways, the articulation of this problem has been well done. The Prime Minister has spoken about it. The United Nations Secretary General has spoken about it, and it's a core theme of what the delegation is trying to project this year, along with Pakistan's successes in conservation and other sorts.
Rafay's audio's gone to mute for some reason.
I'm sorry, I don't know how that happened. Anyway, I don't remember where I was when that happened. So, can you hear me?
Yeah, keep on going. It's on. Yeah.
Okay. So in many ways, I think it's a well coordinated attempt to take this poster child responsibility, as it were, and in the little time that we've had since the floods, be able to coordinate and to get with other countries to be able to articulate it here. How well it goes through the COP is another question. But I think the ministry has to be commended this year because it was handed a huge responsibility, and with its limited resources, it's managed to be able to pull off a good show.
I think the same question from Zoha, and I want to add one thing to this again from a journalistic perspective. There's also certain conversations within Pakistan and within countries like Egypt as well that these countries are known to sort of muzzle dissenting voices. And we've had an example in Egypt for a while. And this came up again at the COP where the UN security had to intervene and stop Egypt's own police from intervening and stopping an activist. So, in the future, for example, the coming COP is the next COP is, for example, scheduled in the UAE. In the future, maybe a COP comes in Pakistan, and you have these voices which are critical of the government, and rightfully so in certain cases, such as in terms of northern Pakistan. You have various issues, such as in terms of the coastal areas of Pakistan. So, as a journalist, you see this sort of contradiction that you have to report in a setting that is usually not very conducive to these discussions. An activist cannot come out and possibly criticize the government so openly as they're being allowed to do at the COP. So, after the COP concludes, what will the press in Egypt do? And in case of the future, how do you see that reporting in these places where voices are usually not allowed as openly? How can journalists keep up the momentum that this has started? And the sort of politicians' ego came into question as well. On one side, they want things to get resolved because it's an ego boost, but they also don't want fingers pointed at them that again this is not going to be a good for it's usually becomes a not good for the country, not good for our image. So as a journalist in this situation, what can the press do? How do we really focus voices which are from these peripheral areas and make sure that they're heard all around the world effectively?
Well, thank you for that question. It's a great one and a very important one. I'll start with the first bit a little bit, just piggybacking off of what Rafay said. Is that previously, again, this is my first COP too, but previously, from what I've heard, what I've read, is that Pakistan always showcased its project, and more often than not, they were either about mitigation or adaptation. The latter, of course, is incredibly important. Mitigation to some extent. And so that has been our approach in the previous years. This year, however, you're right that this role was handed to us because we experienced catastrophic floods. So there was nothing else to say but really push this, conversation forward. One thing I do think the Pakistan delegation could have perhaps done better or have thought about is that I do see a lot of official voices and policymakers and lawmakers and experts and all of that. But the way that indigenous people and indigenous communities do this and small island nations do this is that their delegations or the observers that come with them, they're from communities and parts of those countries that are immediately impacted by climate change. And having those voices talk at your pavilions, at your panels, and helping you push your message across is far more effective than having like policymakers. Because the thing is that even as journalists or the civil society, what we look for is like how to get the message forward, how to get the message across, and the one most effective way to do that is through human voices. So I do think that what the Pakistan delegation could have done better this year was really bring people who were working on the ground, people who were directly impacted by these floods, with them. I know we're pressed for money. I know we've got financial concerns and all of that. But I still do think that there was room for improvement on that aspect. As far as your question about dissenting voices is concerned, the fact that this COP was held in Egypt, it's being held at the Africa COP, but we're having it in a country that does not allow for criticism, is a question that journalists have thought about a lot and how to navigate it. And the problem with things like the COP is that you also have to abide by certain rules, especially considering that country. In Egypt, for instance, when we come here to cover COP, we're not exactly allowed to be journalists outside of this venue. So if I'm covering a protest, if I'm covering any activity outside of this venue, I actually am at a danger of being persecuted as well. And I don't want to be one of those people who pushes responsibility onto someone else, but I do think that this is where civil society and people in general also come in and have to play their part, to really advocate for the fact that we need free press. We don't have that in Egypt. We certainly don't have that in Pakistan. And that's also one of the reasons why the climate agenda and even loss and damage for that matter, or Pakistan's vulnerability in terms of climate change, only came to light this year when it was so impossible to ignore. It's not like people in Pakistan haven't been talking about this for a while. We've had activists, civil society organizations, small, indigenous groups of people talking about this. You've got the Pakistan Fishermen's Folk. That's the only organization that comes to mind right now. But what I'm trying to say is like there's grassroots work that's being done. And unless the ministry, unless the people at the top really bring those voices out up front, I don't think that we're going to be able to leverage our position entirely at these international platforms. There's only so much that you can listen to a minister who, let's be honest, is not deeply or directly impacted by this in a way that somebody who's impacted by it in flood-ridden Balochistan or Sindh. And so I really think that those voices should have been there. How, as the press, we're dealing with the dissenting voices part is that we're asking those questions, we're raising it. We're trying to cover the protests or the dissenting voices, at least within the COP venue. And you have quite a lot of those, actually. I know it's limited and I know that it's sort of censored or controlled, but it exists. And so the idea is to continuously amplify those voices and continuously remind people that whatever happens in those corridors of negotiation, there's a whole world outside of that, and there's people outside of that being impacted. And that's where you have to focus. So I guess it's about building a collective more than anything else. Like, it's not up to one person. It's not just up to the NGOs. It's not just up to the press. It's not just up to the state. It's about every single person taking responsibility, if that answers your question.
Got it. I have one question from Rafay, and this is the sort of a controversy that we had on social media, that you now have to tell us the real story here. That you had this image of the Pakistani pavilion, and someone's posted that, oh, there's no one at the pavilion. What is going on? So what was actually going on? How's the pavilion looking? What sort of attention does Pakistan have? I was just comparing a few images that we had that during the press conference of the UN Secretary General, it had like huge crowds over there. And I was thinking about the expo, where the Pakistani expo was one of the most frequented pavilions over there. And I was like, people are generally curious about Pakistan. Maybe it's like we're not interacting with the world enough, but what are the reasons why Pakistan's pavilion was empty on the first day and then suddenly there was huge crowds? What's going on there?
Have you ever been to a ThinkFest, LitFest conference Sunday morning, 10 o'clock, the first panel? You see how thinly attended it is? I mean, come on. right? You take a picture at 9 in the morning when no one's got there. It's not. It's a sort of gotcha. And really, again, the point is the pavilion serves as a center point for Pakistani delegates, whether they're part of the party, whether they're observers, whether they're press, to sort of come. It's a place where you get meet people. And it's also a place for any country or NGO that has a pavilion to sort of press its agenda through these sort of pavilion talks. And in many cases, whatever dignitaries the countries have coming through will use it at some point or the other as a meeting space. So you have to realize that, the real negotiations take place in negotiating rooms somewhere else. The work of the COP takes place somewhere else, right? And someone took a photograph. I think the pavilion's doing all right. We're having 3 events a day, and depending on who's speaking and what the topic is, there'll be anywhere between 10, 12 people to about 50 people at the pavilion, and people dropping in. There's a lot of press that comes in, wants to meet the minister, wants to speak to other people. So it's a sort of hub of activity, that's for sure. That said, just a few rows from where I am, the Brazilian pavilion has some of the finest free coffee you can imagine. And also the Australians have a coffee that's so good, the line there is always like 50 people deep. So you have different ways of getting people to your pavilion.
That's very unfortunate. Pakistan has nothing to offer in these terms. I was assuming that Roti or something.
Offering all sorts of goodies. I'm not offering them. The pavilion's offering all sorts of goodies. There are drinks, there's coffee, but it's not the stuff that you're getting at the Brazilian hall. That's some really nice coffee.
I just like to add to what you said about there being a lot of interest in the Pakistan pavilion at in Dubai at the expo and stuff, and you have to understand that finances for these things come in a very different way, right? Expo banane ke liye or Pakistan pavilion banane ke liye, I mean, Rafay, correct me if I'm wrong, the kind of investment and the kind of money that's been put in is very, very different. Some pavilions, I know that I think it was either the World Meteorological Organization or it was the World Meteorological Organization that have paid $90,000 for drinks and refreshment. That's the kind of money.
Some of the figures I've heard for the pavilions are insane, like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah. So there's no way. I think it's an unfair thing to compare those pavilions to ours. Of course, people are attracted to bright, shiny things. I know I am. I go to the Pakistan pavilion all the time. I'm walking in and out of there. There wasn't any activity on the first day, not just in the Pakistan pavilion, but like 45-50% of the other pavilions. That's when the prime ministers are talking. Nobody cares about that. The third day of the COP is when people start showing up. So I do think that we kind of have to like fact check things as well, and not. I know we love criticizing our government. I promise you, I do too. I think there's a lot of room for improvement. There really is, but at the same time, I think it's kind of unfair. This is not the Dubai Expo, and we don't have $90,000. I would imagine for food, drinks and refreshment.
Right. So speaking of criticism, I wanted to add on to Zoha's comments from earlier as well, and take a question from there. That other activists need to step up, or there are several other organizations that need to be highlighted as well. So why haven't they been thus far? You mentioned Pakistan Fisher Forum, and of course. Then there's Babajan as well, who has been working on the Atabad Lake issue, and there's several other activists that are working there as well. So why have they, I guess, not been brought forward or reached out to? I'm really glad that Rafay is there in an official capacity, and Afia Salam and Tariq Alexander Kesser are over there as well. But I guess we need to move it to the grassroots as well. So I want to ask that. And also, there was trouble with the youth delegation as well. So if Rafay was present at that point in time, so if Zoha could take the first part of it, and then Rafay can, as the eyewitness, talk about the second.
Yeah. So
actually, Zoha, were you at the youth panel?
I was not. I joined at the tail end. I remember you telling me about it. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I can't support you on this. This is entirely you. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Your first part of the question was why haven't these grassroots organizations been highlighted? Rafay, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that there's a bit of
Yeah.
a gap to how the ministry operates and how like these organizations operate. And like, I don't know if there's communication. I haven't seen it, and I've not heard from grassroots organization that I've spoken to who are working on the ground on flood relief as well. Um, so I think that that's where we're kind of like missing out. I also think the fact that this is a federal ministry and so much of the work kind of goes down into the provinces, so we get stuck in this political thicket basically, like whose jurisdiction is what within Pakistan internally. At least those are our big problems. um and so to bypass all of that and for like a small grassroots organization that actually may know a lot about like local adaptation methods or how communities are suffering, their message may not get across to the ministry. Um, and I know that the ministry is shouldering a lot of responsibility right now, but I would still think that this is more on them than this is on the grassroots organization because they don't have the resources or the money or the ability. So you have to actively look. That's how you make representation even within these international platforms equitable. And so I think that state will always have a greater responsibility. That is one opinion that I will hold, even when I'm like giving them brownie points for doing what they're doing. I think they can do more, and in terms of that, I think there's a big gap.
All right. Let me just also say that there is a bit of a federal bias.
Rafay, over to you.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Zoha. There is a bit of a federal bias in what's projected at the pavilion. If you want to talk about the pavilion, take for example the Living Indus document that was recently adopted by the cabinet, that was put together with the ministry and the UNDP. I mean, that has nearly 36 different projects, which, I mean, when you put their price tag together, is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And in many ways, the ministry is seeking to highlight those issues so that it can get funding. Now, funding is key because, as the minister has repeatedly said, her entire year's budget for this year was appropriated for flood relief. The ministry has no money as such. And it's a bit of a mystery to me how they've funded this pavilion and had this delegation. I don't think this delegation is any larger or smaller than previous years, frankly. I mean, utne ministers, parliamentary secretaries, members of the National Assembly Climate Committee, Senate Climate Committee, Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, is tarah ke log aate hain, phir unke saath PSO hota hai. I mean, just your standard protocol, you have the similar size of sorts. But I think funding is a kind of restriction. But I completely agree that having grassroots and indigenous persons representation really makes the case stronger. I do agree with that. Now, what masla were you talking about, Dawar? Or the youth? That's right. So on the first day of actually the second day of the conference, the ministry organized a panel on youth and climate change. And there were 4 wonderful activists from Gilgit-Baltistan, Lahore, Karachi, and Islamabad. And they spoke very well and articulated very well their own, in many cases, deeply personal experiences regarding the climate crisis and how it's impacted their life and their future. I think they were able to articulate it very well. The secretary of the ministry was also present as an audience member, and after the delegation had spoken, he sort of responded in a measured way and asked them to organize themselves and make a case, or rather present him with a set of demands that come from a unified sort of a collective or recognized collective of youth representatives. That said, the panel also had an M&A and our special advisor to the Prime Minister on no less than youth, who, in my opinion, and I even voiced it at the panel, I thought were rather arrogant and was speaking down to the youth. It's important because in many ways, this conference is also trying to mainstream youth voices at the decision-making table. And that really was one of the demands that the young delegates were making at the pavilion that day. And it's very important. And we have to figure out some way of getting younger people onto the, for example, Climate Change Council, where I am, by the way, relieved to find out I'm the second youngest person on the council. Salman Zaidi is the youngest. I mean, and that needs to change. But in these circumstances, when even this COP is trying to mainstream these voices, to have people working for the government or elected representatives act in an arrogant and a condescending manner was completely uncalled for. And and फिर उनकी शान में गुस्ताखी हो गई थी, फिर वो नाराज हो गए. फिर मैं और क्या कह सकता? I mean, it was as trivial as that. And really, those youth delegates didn't deserve it. Because if you're an elected representative or you represent the government, and I think the Secretary Climate Change absorbed those comments and gave a positive critique back, a positive response back. These two, on the other hand, left a lot to be desired.
So I think we're at the 35-minute mark already. So possibly last two questions. Coming back from the COP, it's still going on. I think how many days are left? I think 4 or 5 days are still left, and 3 days. Oh, there's a lot of time. So there's still a lot of things that are going to go down in terms of negotiations, in terms of possibly coming up with the facility that you mentioned, that there's certainly some movement towards it. And maybe not getting to figure out what happens and how the facility works, but at least the recognition that loss and damage is going to be coming aside, adaptation and mitigation. In the future, let's say a country like Pakistan, a developing country, and Pakistan already has a huge donation appeal from the UN, which is still unmet. I think the appeal was for about $1 billion or $2 billion, and the amount they've been able to get so far is $200 million or something. So in terms of existing mechanisms, particularly, there's a criticism that not enough has already been done with the existing facilities. So is there any sort of understanding of how to redo these facilities? Can something be done to rework them to be make them more effective? From the country's side, I know there's within Pakistan, there's this criticism that you don't have enough institutions to really manage or have the capacity for any financing that comes in. It's the government which comes in. You have big institutions that try to work along with them, but nothing has happened in terms of, for example, adaptation. So to rework these existing facilities, is there anything happening from countries from our perspective as well to make them more effective? And do you think that the $100 billion mark can be reached in the next year? Because it's still not. I'm not sure if in any of the previous years since the Paris Accord, we've had $100 billion in climate finance. So if these previous promises aren't met, what is to say that the new facility or just the recognition of loss and damage will be enough? And at that point, a layman, particularly people who are not associated with the climate change field, someone who is a typical citizen, has very little to do and gets their information from news clips, they're very, very disappointed. And they're like just saying, what's the point of all of this? Why waste these resources? So where do we stand on how much can we get from the existing facilities in case loss and damage does not really happen? And Rafay, you can take it, and then possibly Zoha, if you have anything to add as well, we'd like to hear upon it.
Dawar, paise hain. When Notre Dame burnt, they got nearly $1 billion in 2 weeks in donations. Pucha bhi nahi. ठीक है? We asked for about 800 million. The UN relief is about 800 million, just above, and have gotten just over 130 million. And that points to a sort of moral case to be made, that we know the money is there, right? Who's funding the war in Ukraine, the proxy war in Ukraine? What was the cost per day of the war on terror? What were the bailouts given during the financial crisis and during the pandemic? We know the money is there. And it sort of crystallizes an understanding that in many ways, this 1.5 and 2 degrees temperature increase they're not thresholds as such. They're really the most amount of death and destruction and carnage world leaders, especially from the global north, can accept politically within their own constituencies. And this is the moral argument. You cannot let other people die because you can get away with it. I can't frame an answer in a technical sense. I have to make a plea that's based in morality and what's just, right? Because we know the money is there. The other things about accessing it and the transparency, those are details that we can work on, and they're crucially important. One can't forgive misgovernance in Pakistan, not at all. But in many ways, this climate crisis is, we don't understand the sense of urgency it requires and just how serious it is. And then it's frustrating and at times heartbreaking to know that when you do have the resources and finances and the ability, you're not doing it because the people who are affected are not you. That's discrimination and it shouldn't be allowed.
I mean, I'm going to echo exactly what Rafay said. Like, this is not about economics or finance, it's about political will. That's what our minister said as well. The money is there. We're not ready to talk about the fact that capitalism is what got us here. We're not ready to talk about the fact that degrowth is what is required. We're not ready to talk about the fact that the money will come when you tax rich people, when you tax billionaires. We're not ready to talk about the fact that fossil fuels got us here and we're still investing over and over again. This time we have more fossil fuel engagement and presence at COP than we've ever had. It's absolutely ridiculous. I have been in panels where I've heard leaders from small island nations that are talking about their countries and the devastation that they face as they're speaking on those panels. I had a friend from Trinidad and Tobago moderating a panel saying he got a notification that there was immense flooding in his country as he was speaking. Like, this is human lives we're talking about, right? I completely agree with Rafi. It doesn't matter. Like, sure, the devil is in the details, but let's get the global north to a point where they're ready to accept responsibility. This is about that. Like, that's all we're asking for. We're not talking about the fact that there isn't misgovernance in Pakistan. We absolutely need transparency. We need to set up mechanisms and infrastructure for how funds are managed. But that is not what got us here. The global north did. And yes, they shy away from the word reparation, but that is the word we have to keep using. This is exactly how we're going to get anywhere with this conversation. I can't not get angry when I talk about this. Like, I understand the sentiment. Like, I can't not, because people are dying. People are going into the winter in Pakistan without shelter over their heads. And so to have somebody like John Kerry say that we cannot consider a finance facility because it's going to bring liability. Of course, it's going to bring liability because you are liable. And that's the argument that we're trying to make. Everyone, I think, with any sense of morality is trying to make. So it's an emotional answer, but that's the only one to give.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So like I actually wanted to add to the to the question. Speaking of global north, like have there been do you know thus far as far as the negotiations and everything is concerned, have there been any specific points that support developing nations, and especially Pakistan, in tackling climate action in the future, and not just as far as funds are concerned, but also as far as helping develop the infrastructure? Have there been any commitments from the global north to Pakistan?
I can, off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Sorry, Rafa, do you want to take this?
No, please go ahead.
Off the top of my head, there are some that have been made. I know that Austria has made a commitment of about $50 million. I know New Zealand made a bit of a commitment as well. So we've got a total of about $244.5 million in loss and damage commitment. I do also want to make a point that a majority of the commitments that have been made were by countries that are led by women. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a woman. I'm saying that because uh, climate change is also a gender justice problem, and it's a human rights problem. And you saw that picture that came out on the first day, right? The infamous family photo of world leaders. You don't have women on the table. You don't have marginalized communities on the table, the ones that are most impacted. So unless you have them, I don't think these commitments are going to reach the level that we need them to be. But there have been some, and that's exactly, I think that's what we hold on to when I was talking about believing and hoping. That there are factions of society, and there are people out there who understand that there's responsibility to be taken and work to be done.
Thank you for saying that, Zoha. I just want to also point out that it's now Norway, New Zealand, Scotland, which pledged money earlier, and now Austria. Four countries that have coughed up or put their money where their mouth is, two of which are governed by women. And again, just like capitalism got us here, the patriarchy also got us here. And these are systems that need to be dismantled and replaced.
I think that's actually a great point because we're about to conclude, and that's often something that we keep on forgetting on what sort of impacts from a gender lens that we're facing. Uh, it's only, I think, possibly we are moving in the right direction that the previous state minister for climate change and the current federal minister is also a woman from our side. So possibly, I hope that this sort of tradition continues, that at least the voices that have uh, a better understanding than men are in those positions of power in countries like Pakistan. And I think with that, we will conclude here. It was a pleasure to have you both, and very, very good to see that Rafay from our side is representing and interacting with where is required for such input from our side, and also that Zoha is has been actively reporting on very, very key issues in Pakistan. And one of the articles both of us read to inform ourselves of what was going on was your Inside Climate Change article on this. So it was a pleasure to have you both, and maybe in the future again we'll have you if there's any good news from the COP.
Or if there's more masala from the top. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that as well.
No,
Thank
absolutely. We'd like to stay in touch. Please do, let us know whatever the new developments are, and we'll try to get your opinion once again, like after COP is over, and groundwork is supposed to start. And till then, we'll stay glued to your Twitter accounts as well, and Facebook, and wherever we can find your details from you. We'll keep doing that.
We'll basically be stalking you a lot.
Exactly. So with that, thank you, Dawar, for your time as well, and we're going to conclude. And we would like to ask our viewers, whoever's been watching, to subscribe as well, so that you can get as much information about COP. We'll try to keep providing information through the portal on the environmental. Thank you Zoha, thank you Rafay, thank you